From Long John Silver in Treasure Island, 1950, to Estella in Cruella, 2021, the Walt Disney Company has brought to life some of the most memorable and unique characters in entertainment history. With over 300 original live-action films produced since 1950, allowing for each of the thousands of characters to remain an individual can be a challenge. Luckily, the talented filmmakers and artisans tasked with this responsibility have been able to do just that, effortlessly individualizing each character so that it may live within the story and embark on its own journey through the audience's imagination. Over the years, the Walt Disney Archives has aimed to collect and preserve important pieces of jewelry and accessories from as many of the company's iconic productions as possible. Today you will have the opportunity to see some of our favorite pieces from the history of the Walt Disney Company. We are thrilled to welcome you to All That Glitters, the crown jewels of the Walt Disney Archives. Although much of a film's story is conveyed through screenwriting, directing or cinematography, for the characters, the clothes and accessories worn inform the audience of who they are well before the first line is spoken. Costume designers have long played a crucial role in the filmmaking process for that very reason. The color, shape and flow of a costume can dictate much about the character's path through the world of the film that he or she exists in, but often, it is the smaller, sometimes overlooked elements of a costume that truly define the strength of a hero or the cunning of a villain. The accessories of a costume allow the audience to immediately identify who this character is and their purpose in the context of the story. A king's crown, a bride's ring, a pirate's necklace, and a banker's watch are all examples of elements that give the audience a glimpse into the character's personality and role. A costume designer's work isn't just about creating a beautiful dress or selecting the perfect garment. They must use their in-depth understanding of the character to examine every minute detail of the costume in order to enhance the personality. Along with clothing, costume jewelry and accessories play a tremendous part in bringing a character to life. Designers work with craftsmen, artisans, and stylists to ensure each individual piece is just right. Jewelry has been an important design element of wardrobes from around the world and throughout time. Usually worn as an ornamental adornment to enhance one's attire, accessories are an object or set of objects that are added to make the attire more attractive or useful. Costume jewelry pieces serve the same purpose as the various accessories we see in everyday life, with one exception: they are only meant to look authentic. The reality is that most costume jewelry pieces are made from materials far less expensive than the precious stones and metals they are representing. Although a diamond on screen may look like a priceless and rare diamond, it is very likely nothing more than plastic and glitter. Although the pieces used on screen may be only costume jewelry, they are often modeled after historic pieces that reflect the culture, social status or specific time period of a film or character. Here we take a special look at some real jewelry pieces from the collections of the Bowers Museum side by side with some faux film counterparts. Though Modjeska's acting never graced the silver screen, the Polish thespian was among the most famous Shakespearean stage actors in the United States around the end of the 19th century. Starring in roles from Cleopatra to Lady Macbeth, she wore a great many pieces of jewelry and adornment over her 46-year career. Just as they do in Hollywood productions, costume designers for Modjeska's plays looked to history to create seemingly authentic outfits for Modjeska to wear on stage. This explains how the costume jewelry she wore over 100 years ago might bear resemblance to pieces made within the last couple decades. I Love Thee Ring. William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet, 1996. Originally created for the close-up shot of I Love Thee, engraved on the inner band, this larger-than-life ring never actually appeared on screen in Romeo plus Juliet, 1996. Instead, the production team accomplished the same end result using the normal-sized prop ring. The plus sign in the title and on the ring is no coincidence. A lot of importance is put on the development of the graphic language within a Baz Luhrmann film, and particularly the titles of the movies. with Romeo plus Juliet or R plus J Mr. Luhrmann had the double idea of developing the title to be incorporated into the natural branding of the ring scene in this pre-production piece. A character's development does not start and stop with an actor's portrayal. As viewers, we engage with characters when all elements align: script, actors, director, sets, props, and costumes, immersing us into the story. Every detail of a costume is a precise decision: appearance, time period, size, proportion, material, color, and patina are all taken into consideration to ensure each piece will add to character development rather than detract. From an accurate wristwatch or subtle necklace, to a set of large earrings once fashionable in a specific time period, all of these choices must be considered. These are the curatorial decisions that bring to life the characters that we love and are showcased here. In some instances, a piece of jewelry becomes a character itself. The necklaces seen here not only served as adornments on screen, but were built into the story as pivotal plot points. Whether it is the cursed Aztec gold medallion from Pirates of the Caribbean, the Curse of the Black Pearl, 2003, or the Edwardian-style pendant that convinces Cruella she must seek her revenge, these meaningful and stunning pieces have provided drive and purpose, while also bringing beauty to the silver screen. The 17 necklaces and pendants seen here are just a few of the memorable ornamentations of our favorite cinematic moments. Necklace. Heart of the Ocean. Titanic, 1997. Worn by Kate Winslet. Courtesy of Lightstorm Entertainment. A fictional pendant, but one of legend nonetheless. In the award-winning film, Titanic, the Heart of the Ocean was purportedly worn by King Louis XVI and was a gift given to the film's main character, Rose DeWitt Bukater, a young first-class passenger on the famed and ill-fated cruise liner Titanic. The design for this beautiful necklace was inspired by one of the largest blue diamonds in the world, the 45-carat Hope diamond. Necklace. Baroness von Hellman. Cruella, 2021. Worn by Emma Thompson. That necklace is the reason I'm dead. This statement, made by Estella in the opening sequence of 2021's Cruella, sets the expectation that this pendant will help to guide the plot. The beautiful opal-like pendant quickly becomes a driving force of the plot, as Cruella seeks her revenge on the villain of the story. This beautiful piece of costume jewelry is a perfect example of exactly how pivotal one piece of jewelry or accessory can be. Not all costume jewelry and accessories are unique and created for the screen, but don't be fooled. An incredible amount of time and thought goes into scouring the real world for the perfect piece to complete a character's look. This is particularly true when it comes to the selection of timepieces. Here we will take a look at classic pocket watches, extravagant Rolexes, and futuristic pre-smartwatch multifunction wristwear, all in chronological order. Nothing accentuates nobility like a properly worn crown or tiara. When we imagine royal characters, and in some cases, not so royal, from classic Disney films, we often picture them in one of these iconic pieces of headwear. Crafted with care and thought, these accessories have been designed and assembled with the designated character's regality in mind. Whether constructed of metal and gemstones, or fitting into a film's budget with the use of plastics and imitation pearls, these pieces have enhanced some of the most memorable moments on film. The most fantastical stories don't always come from completely fictional origins. In fact, some come from the retelling of true stories. When recreating real-life people or events, costume designers work much like an archivist or researcher does, studying fine details of historical characters to replicate their fashion or style with precise accuracy. When first introduced to a character, we often overlook the earring worn by the pirate, or the wedding band on the finger of the film's lead, and what often goes unnoticed is precisely what matters most. The intricate work of selecting these minute adornments creates a seamless character in the viewer's mind, perhaps even subconsciously. While we usually see a character within the bigger picture, there are often incredible details to be enjoyed when we take a closer look. 500 years, from 250 before Christ era to 250 after Christ, people on the west coast of Mexico developed a thriving culture. Because they left no written language, all that is known about them comes from their ceramic art, which, for its time, is rivaled only by the Han Dynasty in China. This art is the visual voice of the ancient people, but to this day ethnographers and art historians have not clearly interpreted what the artists were saying. One thing is certain, the ancient artists of West Mexico found beauty in ordinary things and celebrated life in all its complexity and diversity. The Shaftoon culture was named because this group's only remaining structures are large, underground burial chambers, connected to the surface by a vertical shaft, sometimes up to 40 feet deep. The low-fired, fragile ceramics survived for more than 2,000 years because they were placed in the tombs along with the dead. Had they been left on the surface, they would have returned to the earth they were made of. Distinct artistic styles developed in what are now the modern states of Colima, Jalisco, and Nayarit. Although the art from each area is different, they were all culturally connected. The same imagery appears throughout West Mexico, and figures from different stylistic areas sometimes appear together in one tomb. It is thought that the ceramic sculptures served as companions, guides, and guardians of the spirit of the deceased, and/or that they represented what the deceased knew or believed while alive. Many are vessels, often with a spout, so they might have provided a symbolic form of nourishment to be enjoyed in the afterlife. It is not certain whether the ceramics were made only to be interred, as some show signs of being handled above ground. In sharp contrast to the courtly art of other cultures in Mexico, such as the Maya and Aztec, the artists of the Pacific coast sculpted images of daily village life and people engaged in ordinary activities, such as playing ball, preparing food, petting dogs, nursing children, feasting, playing instruments, dancing, and lounging. Because so many of the same characters are repeated, the ballplayer, the dwarf, the hunchback, the shaman, the warrior, it can be assumed that they played a role in an oral folklore or mythology. In any artistic tradition, the distortion of human proportions requires technical dexterity and the intention to express an idea. The ancient artists of West Mexico excelled at distorting anatomical parts of the body, along with animals and plants, for maximum aesthetic effect. One of the most common subjects from all the regions is the dog. They were raised to be eaten, but they were also loved and cared for as pets. Many of the sculptures feel like portraits of both people and dogs. Ceramic dogs placed in tombs may have had a role in guiding the spirit of the deceased, sniffing out a trail to the afterlife, or may have been included simply because they were considered part of the family. Also included in this new installation are other recent additions to the Crocker's collection of international ceramics, including recently acquired ceramics from Ecuador, gifts from Melza and Ted Bar. Pottery making traditions are passed down from generation to generation, so it is no surprise to see similarities between the ancient and modern ceramics created in the cultures along the Pacific coast of the Americas. There are also Chankay figures and erotic figural vessels with stirrup-shaped spouts from the ancient Moche people of Peru, circa 400–600 CE. Scholars have viewed Moche erotic vessels as a catalogue of the sexual practices of the Moche people intended to demonstrate methods of contraception, portray ritual or ceremonial acts, convey moralizing content, or even express Moche humor. Who were the first Californians? It is a widely believed theory that the first inhabitants of the land we call California were descendants of people who crossed the narrow Bering Strait during the last ice age. Scientists have proposed the hypothesis that these people walked over a now vanished land bridge connecting Asia with Alaska as they hunted for mammoths. Over thousands of years, they settled throughout the North and South American continents. Archaeologists have discovered petroglyphs and stone tools that provide evidence of indigenous cultural groups living in California at least 10,000 years ago, perhaps much earlier. These discoveries provide clues to how the first Californians lived. When Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain in 1492, he was seeking a passage to India. Instead, his ships made landfall on an island in the Caribbean Sea. Thinking he had reached his destination, he referred to the people he encountered as Indians. Because this term is geographically inaccurate, in the 20th century the terms Native Americans and American Indians began to be used as alternatives. This guide uses the term First Californians to refer to indigenous peoples who inhabited the land known today as California. We use the term Native Americans to refer to individuals in contexts that are not limited to previous inhabitants of present-day California. Where possible, we also use tribal names that reflect how individual cultural groups describe themselves. In this guide, we will look at the environments in which the first Californians lived, and how those environments impacted their daily lives and their cultures. Native Americans shared knowledge within their cultural groups and passed it along from one generation to the next through the spoken word. They did not keep formal written histories. As a result, we may have many questions about the lives of the first Californians who lived thousands of years ago. For example, what kind of games did indigenous children like to play? Or, how did first Californians create the mysterious petroglyphs that appear on rocks, and what do they mean? These carvings contain intricate symbols that resemble ancient Mayan, Egyptian, Hebrew and Hindu writings for which we can only guess the origins. Natural environment encountered by the first Californians was rich with natural resources. Rivers, streams and coastal areas were filled with an abundance of fish and other sea creatures. Forests contained a variety of acorns, nuts and berries. In many areas, plant and animal life was so plentiful that even densely populated villages did not need to grow their own food. Instead, they lived as hunters and gatherers. Habitats of Southern California include freshwater marshes, coastal shoreline, grasslands, woodlands, deserts and mountains. In most of the region, the climate consists of warm, dry summers and mild, wet winters. There are many sunny days and rainfall is rare. In Central California, a large valley runs parallel to the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Two rivers flow on opposite ends of the valley, with wetlands occurring near the riverbanks. Desert grasslands lie at the valley's southern end where the climate is dry. Northern California habitats include redwood forests with some of the oldest and largest trees on the planet. Near the Pacific Ocean, the climate is moist and foggy, averaging 100 inches of rain throughout the year. Native Americans tended to settle in territories that included a variety of environmental conditions, or life zones. These were defined by atmospheric conditions, soil moisture, density, altitude and local species of plants and animals. The land and its natural resources determined the types of homes people built, the food they ate. Nearly every Native American cultural group has a traditional style of dress by which they can be identified. In pre-contact California, men wore breechcloths, a long piece of bark or buckskin tucked over a belt. They also wore kilts for ceremonial purposes, warmth and protection. Women wore a skirt or a two-piece apron made of woven plant fibers. The length, design and material varied from one cultural group to another. In the temperate California climate, indigenous people did not need to wear much clothing. What they did wear was made with plant fibers, bird skins and small animal hides. They often went barefoot, but if the terrain was rough, they wore sandals made with fibers from the yucca plant. During cold weather, both men and women made capes made from rabbit fur, deerskin or otter, which also doubled as blankets. Woven basketry caps were worn, mainly to carry loads. Both men and women decorated their faces and bodies with tattoos. They adorned themselves with flowers, feathers and strings of beads made from stones or shells. During important rituals and ceremonies, warriors, leaders and healers wore clothing that combined feathers, bones, fur and seashells. After colonization by the Spanish, first Californians' clothing styles changed as they adapted certain articles of European clothing such as vests and jackets, which they decorated with shells or glass beads. The design and use of tools is an indicator of human resourcefulness. Archaeologists have found evidence of the use of stone tools by people living in California thousands of years ago. First Californians used resources from the environment to create tools to help them accomplish tasks that improved their daily lives. Stones were used as pounding tools and for making weapons such as axes, arrows, spears, and knives. Large pieces of soapstone were made into cooking pots which would not break when placed over an open fire. Shoulder blades of animals were used to scrape hides to make clothing and leather straps. Bows and arrows were fashioned from wood and twisted grass. Strings, with tips made of obsidian, a volcanic glass. Animal bones were used for harpoons. Humans are not the only beings that made tools. A vulture, for instance, can pick up a rock with its beak and use it to crush an ostrich egg, its favorite food. Chimpanzees can strip leaves off twigs to use as sticks when they fish for insects. However, humans are unique in their ability to adapt a tool for different purposes if the situation calls for it. This requires creative thinking. Native Americans used art as a form of communication. They created mysterious petroglyphs. They wove beautiful baskets made from plant fibers. They created ground paintings using colored sand that consisted of powdered pigments of varying colors and textures to depict spirit or sacred symbols. In addition to the visual arts, indigenous people engaged in storytelling, music, dance, and other forms of art and entertainment. Spiritual leaders told stories to explain natural events. Musicians fashioned wooden clappers made from elderberries, as well as rattles made from turtle shells attached to gourds and sticks to make rhythmic sounds. Headdress, c. 1900. Shasta, Northern California flicker feathers and string. 4x 25 inches Bowers Museum F85165 Foundation purchase with funds from Mrs. Augusta J. Hoyles. Dance has figured prominently in the ceremonies of indigenous peoples, as a way to give thanks, celebrate victory or pray for a bountiful harvest. Themes of nature such as the four cardinal directions, north, south, east and west, appear frequently in dances, as well as movements that represent animals held in deep regard by the community. Dancers wore these headdresses at special ceremonies. Events, such as the Acorn Festival or the Flower Festival, were central to the lives of Native Americans. Today, traditional ceremonies bring people together to celebrate their shared cultural heritage. First Californians obtained food by hunting, fishing and gathering. Some lived near rivers or lakes. Others lived in the mountains, valleys or the desert. The natural resources of these different ecological zones determined their food supply. First Californians ate many plants such as acorns and mushrooms. They hunted for birds and small game and fished for seafood. First Californians drank water and juice made from pressed fruits and nuts. The abundance of natural resources allowed families to stay in one place all year round. They traded with neighboring cultural groups for what they needed. Hunting and fishing, first Californians used bows and arrows to spear birds, rabbits, and deer. They also hunted for snakes, coyotes, antelopes and mountain lions. Even insects such as wasps, grasshoppers and caterpillars were part of their diet. Animals' bodies provided many kinds of raw materials, including fur, skin and bone. Few resources went unused. Men paddled canoes made from tule grasses, bark or hollowed-out logs, using harpoons to catch dolphins and sea lions, and abalone fish hooks to catch seafood. Gathering, live oak trees grew in northern, central and southern California. Acorns were an important part of first Californians' diet. They were gathered, washed to remove bitter acids, then ground with a mortar and pestle into meal used to make soup, bread and porridge. The abundance of acorns was one reason first Californians had no need to develop agriculture. Californians also gathered cactus fruit, wild oats, pine nuts and berries, along with root crops such as wild onions and agave. The wild foods gathered, and the tools they used to do so, varied depending on where they lived. First Californians built their homes with materials that came from nature. In Northern California, cone-shaped teepees were made with bark from trees that grew in the forests. In Southern California, tule, strong grass reeds that grew in the marshlands, were combined with bent willow branches to construct dome-shaped huts. Polynesian culture, the beliefs and practices of the indigenous peoples of the ethnogeographic group of Pacific islands known as Polynesia, from Greek poly, many and nesoi, islands. Polynesia encompasses a huge triangular area of the east-central Pacific Ocean. The triangle has its apex at the Hawaiian Islands, in the north, and its base angles at New Zealand Aotearoa, in the west, and Easter Island, Rapa Nui, in the east. It also includes, from northwest to southeast, Tuvalu, Tokelau, Wallis and Futuna, Samoa, formerly Western Samoa, American Samoa, Tonga, Niue, the Cook Islands, French Polynesia, Tahiti and the other Society Islands, the Marquesas Islands, the Austral Islands, and the Tuamotu Archipelago, including the Gambier Islands, formerly the Mangariva Islands, and Pitcairn Island. At the turn of the 21st century, about 70% of the total population of Polynesia resided in Hawaii. The physical environment of the Polynesian islands is not as favorable for human habitation as it might at first seem. It certainly presented difficulties when the ancestors of the Polynesians entered the area some 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, first settling on the western islands, Wallis and Futuna, Samoa, and Tonga, which were devoid of much that was needed for human habitation. As a result, early peoples had to take in a wide variety of subsistence items, including most of the useful plants and all of the domestic animals they required. The physical environment has continued to exert a marked influence on Polynesian culture. Polynesian cultures have been radically altered by Western colonialism. European explorers navigated much of the area in the latter quarter of the 18th century, and the first missionaries arrived in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Britain annexed New Zealand through the Treaty of Waitangi, 1840, but interethnic tension arose between the indigenous Maori. Other colonial powers that laid claim to various parts of Polynesia included France, Germany, New Zealand, the United States, and Chile. The Spirit and Headhunters exhibit, displaying the tools and weapons of various Pacific Islanders, at the Bowers Museum are interesting exhibits to examine anthropologically. Both recreate existing social and cultural constructions surrounding Japanese and Pacific Islanders. The exhibits reproduce an idealized view of art in both exhibitions. By comparing the two exhibits, we can see clearly how the contrasting treatment of the art from both exhibits reflects the perceived difference between art and artifact, the idealization of art as works requiring creative genius, and the ghettoization and essentialization of ethnic art and consequent ethnocentrism. The Spirit and Headhunters exhibit follows existing models of how primitive art is treated in museums, despite not being recognized as such. The exhibit consists almost entirely of tools or weapons, with the only visual art being large photographs on the walls of native Pacific Islanders. Even these large photographs are obviously taken by non-natives with the power to take pictures of Pacific Islanders with or without their consent. They are presented without any accompanying label with information on where or when the picture was taken, nor by whom the picture was taken, presenting them in such a way as to invite the museum guest to passively accept these images as fact rather than as art. The lack of visual artworks in itself emphasizes the presentation by the Bowers Museum of the art objects as artifact rather than as art, Danto. This is strengthened by the presentation of the objects with an accompanying placard describing their original use. Rather than talking about the object's artistic composition or even giving the objects their own titles, the museum chose to discuss the object's practical use and former cultural significance, reflecting museums' usual treatment of primitive art as having functional roles in their producing societies that had nothing to do with the categories established by Western art history Morphy and Perkins. The only object with a given title is the cannibal fork, which is sensationalistic at best and offensive at worst. This particular object's treatment is also reflective of how the entire exhibit presents the Pacific Island cultures as savage or primitive. The placard indicates that the originating culture's chiefs used forks rather than forks to eat their food, including human flesh consumed during ritual feasts, and goes on to say that humans were eaten along with fish, turtles, birds and pigs. Missionary influence on Polynesian peoples increased over time, and Christianity eventually became an integral part of the islanders' lives. In many areas, Christianity was also influenced by local traditions and customs. Quite commonly, villages competed to build larger and more elaborate churches, and first-time visitors to Polynesia are often surprised at the intensity of the islanders' commitment to Christianity. Many Polynesians were recruited to proselytize other parts of the Pacific, particularly Melanesia. After World War II, local sentiments for decolonization began to spread. Samoa became the first post-colonial Pacific nation when it gained sovereignty from New Zealand in 1962. It has a parliamentary system, but only traditional chiefs, Mate, may vote and run for election. Tuvalu also follows the parliamentary style of government. 3 island groups, Tonga, Tahiti, and Hawaii, had traditionally been monarchies. This form of government survives only in Tonga, where a British-style parliament gives special status to traditional nobles. Most of the remaining island groups have gained some degree of independence from colonial rule. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, is the anomaly of the region. The Aboriginal population was so decimated by European-introduced diseases and by slavers in the 1860s that it almost became extinct. In 1888 the island was annexed by Chile. Its people are now the only Pacific Islanders controlled by a Latin American power. Little remains of Easter Island's original culture. The indigenous Polynesian language, also called Rapa Nui, survives, but most people also speak Spanish. About 1/3 of the island's small population is from Chile. Polynesia has loomed large in the Western imagination for more than 200 years. Idealized images were disseminated around the world from the time of first contact with Europeans. People in Europe avidly read the reports of Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, 1771, Captain James Cook, 1773, and other explorers, and saw images made by the artists who accompanied them. These provided source material for published and widely circulated engravings. This fascination with an imagined paradise continued in the form of fiction, including such novels as Herman Melville's Typee, 1846, and Amu, 1847, and Robert Louis Stevenson's A Footnote to History, 1892, and In the South Seas, 1896, and visual art, particularly that of Paul Gauguin. Bred by these and other artists and by tourist iconography, musicals, and films, the notions of an almost blissfully carefree and easy way of life, devoid of harsh extremes of any type, played out on islands of great beauty and natural abundance, persisted into the 21st century in the popular imagination. Far from conforming to Western notions of paradise, traditional Polynesian cultures were in fact complex, highly specialized, and adapted to environments that could be quite hostile. This important collection of exquisite textiles and silver jewelry on loan to and from the Bowers Museum's permanent collection highlights the beauty and wealth of the Miao peoples of southwest China. This important collection of exquisite textiles and silver jewelry on loan to and from the Bowers Museum's permanent collection highlights the beauty and wealth of the Miao peoples of southwest China. Symbols of status and culture, the elaborate textiles in this exhibition include finely pleated skirts, complex petite patterned cloth, intricate silk embroidery and shining textiles woven with metal. Over 50 examples of ornately designed and created silver bracelets, necklaces and decorative ornaments complement and complete the exhibition of late 19th and 20th century Miao regalia. More than an examination of masterful techniques and beautiful style, these objects reveal hundreds of years of Miao history and tradition and the patience and dedication to achieve beauty. Ancient China covered a vast and ever-changing geopolitical landscape, and the art it produced over 3 millennia is, unsurprisingly, just as varied. Still, despite continuous indigenous technical developments, changes in materials and tastes, and the influence of foreign ideas, there are certain qualities inherent in Chinese art which make it possible to describe in general terms and recognize no matter where or when it was produced and for what purpose. These essential qualities include a love of nature, a belief in the moral and educative capacity of art, an admiration of simplicity, an appreciation of accomplished brushwork, an interest in viewing the subject from various perspectives, and a loyalty to much-used motifs and designs from lotus leaves to dragons. Chinese art would influence tremendously that of its neighbors in East Asia, and the worldwide appreciation of its accomplishments, especially in ceramics, painting, and jade work, continue to this day. The purpose of art. An important difference between China and many other ancient cultures is that a large proportion of Chinese artists were not professionals but gentlemen amateurs, and a few ladies, who were also scholars. Students of Confucius and its sober principles, they were often men of literature who published poetry. Art was, for them and their audience, a means to capture and present the philosophical approach to life which they valued. For this reason, the art they produced is often minimal and without artifice, perhaps sometimes even a little austere to Western eyes. Art, throughout most of China's history, was meant to express the artist's good character and not merely be an exposition of his practical artistic skills. Such Confucian principles as propriety or li were looked for by many of those who produced and consumed art. Naturally, there were professional artists too, employed by the imperial court or wealthy patrons to decorate the walls and interiors of their fine buildings and tombs. Of course, there were, too, thousands of craftsmen working precious materials into objects of art for the few who could afford them, but these were not regarded as artists in the modern sense. The real arts of merit in China were calligraphy and painting. If the art world today is troubled by a certain snobbishness, then the Chinese were perhaps the first to succumb to questions of what is and what is not art. There grew up in China a connoisseurship of art so that more and more people became collectors of it. Texts were printed to guide people on the history of Chinese art with helpful rankings of the various merits of past artists. In a certain way, art became somewhat standardized with conventions to be adhered to. Artists were expected to study the great masters, copying their works as part of their training. One of the most famous and long-lasting sources of advice on judging art is the 6-point list of the 6th century CE art critic and historian He, originally published in his now lost old record of the classifications of painters. When considering the merits of a painting, the viewer should assess the following with point 1 the most important and essential. These relatively rigid rules of art creation and appreciation were, then, largely due to the belief that art should somehow benefit the viewer. The idea, or better, the acceptance that art could and should express the feelings of the artists themselves would only arrive in more modern times. Still, that is not to say there were not, just as in any art anywhere in the world, eccentrics who ignored the conventions and created works in their own inimitable way. There are cases in China of artists who painted to music not even looking at the picture, one who only painted when drunk and used his cap instead of a brush, those who used their fingers or toes to paint, and even one action artist who splashed ink on the silk spread out on his studio floor and then dragged an assistant over it. Sadly, the results of these innovations have not survived to be enjoyed today in the world's museums of Asiatic art. Calligraphy. The art of calligraphy, and for the ancient Chinese it certainly was an art, aimed to demonstrate superior control and skill using brush and ink. Calligraphy established itself as one of the major Chinese art forms during the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE 220 CE, and for 2 millennia after, all educated men were expected to be proficient at it. Some women, or at least certain figures at court, did become known as accomplished calligraphers, most notably Lady Wei, 272–349 CE, said to have taught the great master Wang Zizhi, 303–361 CE. Far more than mere writing, the art used varying thicknesses of brushstroke, their subtle angles, and their fluid connection to each other, all precisely arranged in imaginary spaces on the page, to create an aesthetically pleasing whole. A connoisseurship quickly developed, and calligraphy became one of the 6 classic and ancient arts alongside ritual, music, archery, charioteering, and numbers. The techniques and conventions of writing would influence painting, where critics looked for the artist's forceful use of brush strokes, their spontaneity, and their variation to produce the illusion of depth. Another influence of calligraphy skills on painting was the importance given to composition and the use of blank space. Finally, calligraphy remained so important that it even appeared on paintings to describe and explain what the viewer was seeing, indicate the title, although by no means all paintings were given a title by the original artist, or record the place it was created and the person it was intended for. Eventually, such notes and even poems became an integral part of the overall composition and an inseparable part of the painting itself. There was a fashion, too, for adding more inscriptions by subsequent owners and collectors, even adding extra portions of silk or paper to the original piece to accommodate them. From the 7th century CE, owners frequently added their own seal in red ink. For example, Chinese paintings, it seems, were meant to be perpetually handled and embellished with fine calligraphy. Painting. Chinese painters painted on various materials in many formats. The most popular formats were on walls and coffins and boxes, screens of silk scrolls which were designed to be looked at in the hand or hung on walls, for horizontal and for vertical, fixed fans, book covers and folding fans. The most popular materials with the earliest artists were wood and bamboo, but then the following were adopted: plastered walls, silk and paper. Canvas would only be used widely from the 8th century CE. Brushes were made from animal hair, cut to a tapering end and tied to a bamboo or wood handle. Significantly, they were precisely the same instruments used by the calligrapher. The inks used were made from rubbing a dried cake of animal or vegetable matter mixed with minerals and glue against a wet stone. Each artist had to laboriously make their own inks, as there was no commercial production of them. The 2 most popular themes of Chinese painting were portraits and landscapes. Portraits in Chinese art began in the Warring States period, 5th–3rd century BCE, and were traditionally rendered with great restraint, usually because the subject was a great scholar, monk or court official, and so should, by definition, have a good moral character which should be portrayed with respect by the artist. For this reason, faces are often seemingly impassive, with only the merest hint of emotion or character subtly expressed. Often the character of the subject is much more clearly expressed in their attitude and relationship to other people in the picture. This is especially true of portraits of emperors and Buddhist figures. There were, however, instances of more realistic portraits, and these can be seen particularly in the wall paintings of tombs. A branch of portraiture was to paint historical figures in certain instructive scenes from their life which showed the benefits of moral behavior. Naturally, there were also paintings of people which had less lofty aims, and these include the popular scenes of Chinese family life which are usually set in a garden. Landscape painting had been around as long as artists had, but the genre really took off during the Tang dynasty, when artists became much more concerned with humanity's place in nature. Typically, small human figures guide the viewer through a panoramic landscape of mountains and rivers in Tang paintings. It should be no surprise that mountains and water-dominated landscape painting, is the very word in Chinese for landscape, translates literally as mountain and water. Trees and rocks are also featured, and the whole scene is usually meant to capture a particular season of the year. Colors were limited in use, either everything in various shades of a single color, illustrating the roots and calligraphy, or two colors combined, usually blues and greens. In accordance with the Taoist belief in the benefit of contemplating serene nature, there is rarely anything to disturb the tranquility of landscape paintings such as farm laborers, and no specific location is intended to be depicted. Later periods would, though, see more intimate and abstract scenes of nature concentrating on very specific themes such as bamboo gardens. Detailed paintings of a single animal, flower, or bird were especially popular from the Song dynasty, 960-1279 CE onwards, but these were regarded as artistically inferior to the other categories of Chinese painting. Still, certain animals became symbolic of certain ideas and appeared in paintings just as they had already in other art forms like bronze work. For example, a pair of mandarin ducks denoted a happy marriage, a deer stood for money, and fish for fertility and abundance. Similarly, plants, flowers, and trees had their own meanings. Bamboo grows straight and true like a good scholar should be, the pine and cypress represent endurance, peaches long life, and each season had its own flower, peony, lotus, chrysanthemum, and prunus. Depth was achieved in paintings by introducing mist or a lake in the middle ground, giving the illusion that the mountains are further behind. Other devices include using paler ink and fainter strokes to paint more distant objects, while foreground objects are rendered darker and more detailed. Painting the scene with several different viewpoints and multiple perspectives is another common characteristic of Chinese painting. One of the most famous of all Chinese landscape paintings is the 8th century CE painted silk panorama known as the Emperor Ming Huang traveling in Shu. It is a sprawling and detailed masterpiece of mountain scenery in the typical Tang style, using only blues and greens. The original is lost, but a later copy can be seen at the Palace Museum of Taipei. Sculpture. Large-scale figure sculpture has not survived well, but some monumental examples can still be seen, such as those cut from the rock face at the Longmen Caves, Fengsan Temple near Luoyang. Dating to 675 CE, the 17.4-meter-high figures represent a Buddhist heavenly king and demon guardians. Another celebrated example of Chinese sculpture on a life-size scale are the figures of Shihanti's terracotta army. Over 7,000 figures of warriors, 600 horses and several chariots were set to guard the tomb of the 3rd century BC Qin emperor. Much effort was made to render each figure unique, despite them all being made from a limited repertoire of assembled body parts made from molds. Faces and hair, in particular, were modified to give the illusion of a real army composed of unique individuals. Regarding smaller-scale works, the Shang dynasty, c. 1600 to 1046 BCE is famous for its cast bronze work. Common shapes of bronze vessels are three-legged cauldrons, sometimes with the legs made into animals, birds, or dragons. They can be circular or square, and many have lids and handles. Chart relief decoration includes repeating patterns, masks, and scroll motifs. The Shang artists also produced vessels in the form of three-dimensional animals such as rams, elephants, and mythological creatures. In the Han period, small-scale sculpture took the form of stone or bricks stamped and carved with relief seams, and they are particularly common in tombs. Outstanding examples come from the Wu Lian Shrine at Jiaxiang. Dating to 151 CE or 168 CE, there are some 70 relief slabs which carry scenes of battles and famous historical figures, such as Confucius, all identified by accompanying texts and covering a chronological Chinese history in a pictorial record similar to a history book. Also in the Han period, cast bronze sculptures of horses were popular. These are usually depicted in full gallop with only one hoof resting on the base so that they almost appear to be flying. Earthenware figurines of single-standing women, men, and servants are common from the Han period. Cast bronze was used to make small figurines and ornate incense burners. These were often inlaid with gold and silver or gilded. One superb piece is a gilded bronze oil lamp in the form of a kneeling servant girl, which dates to the late 2nd century BCE. While the tombs of emperors and important people sometimes had large figure statues set outside them, most later sculpture was of Buddhist subjects. By the time of the Tang dynasty, the wealth of the Buddhist monasteries permitted a great production of religious art. The most popular subjects, as ever, were the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, and they ranged from miniature figurines to life-size statues. Unlike in previous periods, figures became much less static, their suggested flowing movement even drawing criticism from some that serious religious figures, on occasion, now looked more like court dancers. The Chinese were the masters of pottery and ceramics. They produced everything from heavy and functional storage jars in earthenware to exquisitely decorated bowls in the most delicate of porcelain, from vases to garden stools, teapots to pillows. They produced the first glaze wares, the first green celadons and the first underglaze wares painted with cobalt blue. Early developments in techniques and kilns led to both higher firing temperatures and the first glazed pottery during the Han period. Pottery, especially the vessels painted with a gray slit commonly found in Han tombs, very often imitated the shape and decoration of bronze vessels, and this would be a goal of many potters in later periods. Clay was used to produce small unglazed models of ordinary houses which were set in tombs to accompany the dead and, presumably, symbolically meet their need for a new home. Many such models are complete with adjacent animal pen and figurines of their occupants and animals. Tang potters reached a level of technical proficiency greater than any of their predecessors. New color glazes which were developed in the period included blues, greens, yellows, and browns, which were produced from cobalt, iron, and copper. Colors were mixed, too, producing the three-colored wares the Tang period has become famous for. Rich inlays of gold and silver were also sometimes used to decorate Tang ceramics. In the Yuan, 1271 to 1368 CE and Ming, 1368 to 1644 CE periods, even more famous ceramics would be produced with their distinctive and much copied blue on white decoration, which itself copied earlier Chinese paintings for design ideas. Minor arts. Gold, silver, copper, bronze, ivory, colored glass, enamel, precious stones, semi-precious hard stones, silk, wood, and amber were all materials transformed into art objects by gifted craftsmen, but perhaps the most quintessential Chinese materials of the minor arts were jade and lacquer. Jade was especially esteemed in China for its rarity, durability, purity, and association with immortality. Using circular cutting drills and iron tools, the hard material was carved into all manner of jewelry items, everyday objects and figurines of animals, people, and mythical creatures, especially dragons. Jade was especially used for ritual objects such as the bead disc and zong, kong, tubes, both of which were made in large numbers but are of unknown function. One unique but stunning use of jade was the creation of suits to cover the body of the deceased in Han royal tombs. The suits cover the contours of the body and are made from up to 2,000 individually carved rectangular pieces of jade stitched together using gold or silver wire. Lacquer, a liquid of shellac and resin, was used to coat objects of wood and other materials since the Neolithic period in China. It was used to color and beautify screens, furniture, bowls, cups, sculpture, musical instruments, and coffins, where it could be carved, incised, and inlaid to show off scenes from nature, mythology, and literature. The state sponsored and supervised the production of lacquerware, with different schools of lacquer art producing common forms but with recognizably distinct designs. Lacquerware took the form of plates, cups, and jars. Like pottery, they often imitated metal vessels, but they were decorated more elaborately, particularly with scenes of mythical creatures appearing from behind clouds and probably representing the spirit world of the afterlife.
Bueno, y así terminamos nuestra visita al Museo Bowers, aquí en la ciudad de Santa Ana, en Orange County, California. Este sábado 28 de agosto del año 2021. Usamos más de 3 horas y media para estar aquí adentro. Cientos de fotos, cientos de videos. Trataremos en la brevedad de poner todo en línea para que puedan disfrutar, más que nada mi familia, este bello lugar. Que de verdad yo volvería maravillado una y otra vez, ya que resulta súper interesante poder apreciar todo lo que está aquí. Lo que me gusta es que las exhibiciones no son permanentes, no siempre están aquí. Posiblemente en unos meses van a traer unas exhibiciones diferentes y con gusto regresaremos para volver a experimentar un día como el día de hoy. Hasta la próxima.